Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Dougal, and welcome to today's instalment of the Australian Water Reform Roadshow. A couple of housekeeping points. Today's session will be recorded, and the recording and the slide pack will be made available following the webinar. The panel discussions, for questions during the panel, please direct your questions to the Q&A function on Zoom and select all panelists when you are posting your question. We'll also provide written responses to any unanswered questions. We're also happy for you, for participants to contact us directly for further clarifications and more information. Please provide us feedback. We want to improve these webinars. We want to make it more interesting for you and cover topics that are of interest to you. Thank you. Today's panel consists of three very experienced people in both governance, local government and boards. First, we've got Mayor Doug Chipman. He's the Mayor of Clarence City Council in Hobart. He was first elected Mayor in 2011, and he's also the Chief Owner Representative for Tas Water. We've also got Michael Watson, who's a Board and Governance Advisor. He's a former Chief Financial Officer and Company Secretary of Bowen Water, and he advises a number of government the boards of government-owned corporations. We also have Russell Cooper, the founding Managing Director of Southeast Water in Melbourne, and also Managing Director of Goulburn Murray, an irrigation provider in Victoria. He was also Managing Director of Suez d'Agremont, a engineering services and construction company, both in Australia and in New Zealand, and a member of the Ministerial Advisory Panel on Water. Thank you. Just a couple of rules for engagement during the session. Our panel is cognizant and aware of what's happening in New Zealand and the current state you're at. The sessions are about the Australian reforms and the Australian governance landscape and ownership landscape, and it's aimed at providing you with a reference point to draw comparisons onto your situation currently in New Zealand. We'll endeavour to provide an unbiased view of what's the Victorian and Tasmanian primary landscapes within the context of New Zealand. We ask you to align any questions to the topic, which is governance. And obviously there's no one from DIA here, so please don't ask any questions that are directed at DIA. I will now hand it over to Michael, who will start by talking about corporate governance. Michael.
Thank you, Mark. Welcome, everybody. What I want to do is just set the scene initially before Doug and Russell talk about, respectively, Tasmania and the Victorian experience. But in general, I just want to set the scene what the board member must ensure that they do, and that's they undertake the functions that are fulfilled effectively and are consistent with their governance principles. Their own conduct is consistent, and they set a required standard of conduct for all board members. So what does that mean in practice for governance boards? Strategic and business planning role, which is always a basic fundamental, performance mentoring, reporting, monitoring, risk management, and of course the overall stewardship role. They're the key things that a board must do inside its governance framework. Thanks, Craig. Okay, what we've got here is the ASX, Australian ASX corporate governance principles. Now, why are these important? Well, in Tasmania, in their model, they follow these explicitly, and they also report against them, and that is a major tick for them. What does it do? It allows you to ensure that you've got all the right segments of your business as a board, that you've got everything in place, and we'll talk a bit further later in the session about some of this. But just quickly, we'll go through those. You lay solid foundations for management and oversight. So management understand their role and what the board oversight of their role will be. So it's very clear, there is no ambiguity there. You structure the board to be effective and add value. The board must ensure that's adding value to management and not getting in management's way in discharging its responsibility. Culture, we all hear about culture now on boards. That is absolutely the #1 priority for a board, to ensure the organisation, the board and the organisation's culture is ethical, it's responsible, they act lawfully, and ensure that culture permeates throughout the rest of the organisation. Safeguard the integrity of the corporate reports. So it's vitally important, as you would all understand, that any board, any council, any organisation has a process to verify the integrity of its corporate reports to ensure, and that's why we have audit and risk functions, to ensure that what the board is hearing has been created accurately and reflects the business. Make timely and balanced disclosures. Well, that's a standard for any board, and even in government boards in Australia, there are different mechanisms, but there is always that timely and balanced disclosures, and we'll talk a bit about that later as well. Respect the rights of security holders. That's also important. In Victoria, there's the water corporations have both an owner, a stakeholder, and they have security holders in terms of its treasury function in Victoria of holding the security organisation. Recognise and manage risk. Risk management has become paramount for boards. It is so important that a board understands what its risk is, what its risk tolerance is, but also what its risk opportunities are. And that has to be a responsibility of the board to drive that, to have a risk culture that everyone understands. And the final one is remunerate fairly and responsibly. That's, I think you'd all understand, that's just stock standard, a responsibility of the board to have a remuneration committee and ensure that they attract both the right talent and that they pay the right amount for that talent. And they do that in the total balance of the organisation's culture, and it's done in an ethical manner. Slide, thanks, Craig. Okay, this is a really basic little model, but this is a bit of the Victorian type experience. So there's legislation creating a statutory body. Then there's enabling legislation. Now in Victoria, we have the Water Act and the Water Industry Act. They're very long acts because they're grown up over a number of time, and they're both due for review and have had some review started, preliminary work, and that's on hold during these COVID times for a minute. But they've got an enabling legislation. That enabling legislation clearly identifies the role of the board. It tells the board what their responsibilities are and what they are responsible to do, both to their owner, the state government, but also to their customers and to the community and to the environment. So it's the environment is actually comes across in the Victorian scheme as a natural being. So it has rights and responsibilities. So then what do you have? You have specific legislation relating to a statutory business, which all government businesses have. You have general business legislation. You can't just because you may not be a Corporations Act company, you still have to follow those general business principles. Then you have all the regulations and compliance, whether it be health and safety, whether it be environmental, whether it be compliance and regulation according to pricing. There's a whole realm of those, and you have to ensure as a board of directors that you have mechanisms in place to both track those and ensure compliance. And if you're not compliant, you have to report that and you have to take the right corrective action in the right time. It's not a case of just saying we couldn't meet it. On the right-hand side there of your screen, you'll see there's a board appointment process. And I just want to highlight that because every jurisdiction has a different appointment process. The Victorian one, I can explain fairly simply. It's publicly advertised for a significant period of time. You apply on a website, a Victorian government website, you apply. The government appoints, the government and the department appoints an interview panel. They then interview people. They then make a recommendation to the minister. The minister then follows that through, and that is noted by a meeting of cabinet. But at the end of the day, the minister and the cabinet, they make the final selection. It's their selection there. It's no more independent at that point than that. So that's the Victorian model, whether we love it, whether we don't, that's how it works. And there's over 600 government boards and statutory authorities and regulators that the government goes through the same process for appointment. So there's it's a stock standard method that they use. So that's really the total package of how things come together. And I think we're going to move now, Mark, to
Tasmania. That's right. And we'll hear from Mayor Doug Chipman.
Thanks very much, Mark, and also Michael for the introduction to governance there. Firstly, can I say thank you very much for the opportunity to participate. It's truly a privilege and honour to be able to reach out to such a wide and eminent audience in New Zealand of local government colleagues. So thank you for that opportunity. The Tassie, I've been involved with the evolution going from council ownership of water and sewage assets right through to the current model today. It's been a journey of over 10 years in the making, and it's one that I have great joy in sharing with you and advocating for. My current position as the Chief Owner's Representative carries with it some responsibilities, including chairing the Board Selection Committee, which I'll come to a bit more in a moment. As mentioned already by Michael, the TasWater is structured under corporate law, but there was enabling legislation from the Tasmanian Parliament which set the course and the direction of that for it to form as a corporation under corporate law. The TasWater is owned by 29 local councils in Tasmania and the state government, which holds 10% of the equity. Different councils have different levels of equity. My own council, for example, Clarence, has 11% equity. The equity that councils ended up with was a function of the value of the assets that they put into the corporation when TasWater was first formed. The 29 councils each have one representative, which forms an owner's representative group. Most business is conducted on one vote per member basis, but there are significant, occasional significant issues that are decided on the basis of an equity vote. For example, an agreement to change the constitution requires 75% of the equity vote as well as 75% of the membership vote. On to the board selection process itself, the owners representative group, which is 29 councils and one state rep, elect a board selection committee, and the membership of that's made up, and first of all, it's chaired by the chief owners representative. We have 4 local government members, one from the northwest of Tasmania, one from the north of Tasmania, and 2 from the south, which reflects the relative size of those 3 areas. The board chair is also a member of the board selection committee for all matters other than pertaining to the appointment of a chair or considering the chair's performance. And there's also a state government representative on the board selection committee. The board itself is, the makeup of that is stipulated in the Constitution, and it's an independent skills-based board, and it has 7 directors, including the chair. For example, at the moment, it's made up with 3 women and 3 men. We've got 3 Tasmanians on the board, plus 2 from Victoria and 1 from New South Wales. The structure of the board is essentially, when I say skills-based, we've got 2 experts in the field of water and sewage business. One is, for example, a previous managing director of Sydney Water. Another is previous managing director of Yarra Valley Water in Victoria. So the board has definitely got industry expertise. There are 2 experts in previous chief financial officers of utilities who are currently on the board as finance and corporate governance experts. We also have a person who's community orientated. She is chair of the Tasmanian Community Fund, for example. And so the diversity of the board and the experience of the board is tailored specifically to the requirements of managing, directing the operations of TasWater. I'm happy to take any questions later on in regard to all that, but if you'd like to bring up the next slide. I mentioned that TasWater is set up as a corporation under corporate law, but it was enabled to be such by the Tasmanian Parliament, and the responsible ministers there are the Minister for Finance and the Minister for Water. We have 5 regulators controlling or oversighting TasWater. It's the economic regulator, OTA, which is responsible basically for setting the price and services plan. Currently, we have a 3-year price and services plan, and they analyse, they've got a statutory responsibility to analyse the economic situation, financial situation of TasWater, and set the fees and charges accordingly. The EPA, of course, Public Health, TasFire and WorkSafe Tasmania are the other regulators, and obviously the State Auditor General has a responsibility as well. Reporting is comprehensive. First of all, the obligations under corporate law that have already been mentioned. There's an annual industry performance report, an annual financial report, and quarterly performance reports to the owners. On top of that, each year, TasWater is required to report to the Tasmanian Parliament and go through the government business scrutiny committees and answer questions there. So the chairman, the chief executive officer, and the chief owner's rep normally on an annual basis report to the Tasmanian Parliament and front up there as well. I mentioned the owners, 29 councils in the Crown, the owners representative group, and the owners representative group is responsible for influencing the direction of the corporation via 2 main vehicles. The first is the shareholders' letter of expectation, which I'm happy to go through in more detail later. But basically, it sets out the requirements in broad terms of the strategy of the company, community service obligations, the requirement for dividends and reporting, and a few other things. And the annual corporate plan has to be ticked off and signed off by the owners representative group as well. That covers capital investment, obviously, as well as the normal operations. The owners representative group, I've already mentioned, appoints a board selection committee, which first of all populates the board when there are vacancies, and it also monitors the board's performance on an annual basis. So with that, I think I hold off for any questions. Thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you, Doug. I'll hand it over to Russell now to talk about Victoria.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the opportunity to speak with you today, and certainly wish you well with your deliberations on the changes ahead. So talking now about the way the Victorian water industry is structured, it's got a lot more history than what Tasmania's got in terms of going back to the Water Act of 1989 and the Water Industry Act of 1994. They're both very complicated water acts covering both the situation with rural water and also water supplied to the cities and towns throughout the state of Victoria. There's basically a Victorian Department of Water, which is responsible for appointing the board members to the 15 or so authorities across the state. There's an organisation called DELP, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and a minister there. She gets very much involved in the final selection of directors that go onto the boards. There's always an endeavour to try and get a mix of skill-based people on boards that can provide the necessary oversight and to help to control the direction of the organisation. Going into the bottom of that, slide there, we've got the managing directors and the senior executives of each of the organisations that are responsible for the day-to-day management in accordance with the law and the directions that might come from the board, and indeed trying to meet government policies and objectives that sometimes change in terms of direction. And along the way, there's really three regulation bodies on the right-hand side there you can see. So there's the Essential Services Commission, or the ESC, which is involved with regulating prices. So each of the water authorities presents a plan every couple of years for a 3-year pricing pathway, looking at where capital is going to be spent, what sort of things are going to change, and what the need is for rate revenue coming from the customers. And the Essential Service Commission needs to weigh that up and come up with a determination of, yes, X% increase in fees or whatever it might be. Then there's the EPA, the Environmental Protection Authority, very much involved with making sure that environmental discharges, particularly the output of wastewater treatment plants into streams and creeks and rivers, is appropriate. From time to time, there are spills. The organisation I was involved with, South East Water, spans the eastern side of Port Phillip Bay, that's part of Melbourne metropolis, and because there's a lot of sewage infrastructure that runs around the cliffs around that Port Phillip Bay, if there's a spill that occurs there because of a blocked sewer or a pumping station that's failed to operate, it's down onto the beach quite quickly, and the EPA gets involved with beach closures or protection works or whatever's required. In my time with South East Water, there was always a lot of emphasis in terms of let's have as few of these sorts of events as possible, and what sort of things could be done to mitigate against those, like detention tanks or backup generators for pumping station, were all very, very important. And the EPA was clearly on top of all of that. Then there's the Department of Health, Human Services. They're involved with making sure that we're meeting the drinking water guidelines, and these change from time to time, and always looking to improve the level of service and the quality of water provided for drinking water purposes. So I think that covers that slide, please. Thank you. So then, looking at the structure there, we've got the State Parliament of Victoria, above the ministers of the various departments. So going from left to right, there's the Water Resource Management, or DELP, as we saw in the earlier slide, Environment Minister, Water Resource Planning, entitlements, arrangements there. In amongst that, service delivery, financial performance monitoring is Treasury. The Department of Treasury is involved in making sure that those things are operating effectively, and they have a great input to what level of dividends are provided back to government each year. In the case of Melbourne, with the 3 retail businesses, they were set up in 1995 to deliver significant dividends back to government each year. That's not the case with the regional water authorities. Some of those are make a reasonable profit contribution, a dividend contribution. Others are more in a break-even type of situation. But in any event, Treasury is where those things are decided. You heard before from Michael about the appointments to the boards to ensure appropriate governance. Obviously, the ministers have oversight on that, and once the proposed new persons are planned to be selected onto a board, goes through a check and balance within government itself. And some of the policies and strategies coming from government also work down to the next level. So looking at that next level, we're really then at the area of the service delivery entities. So we've got on the one side the catchment management authorities. These organisations are involved in making sure the river health is maintained, the streams are working appropriately, looking after drainage into the streams in many cases. Moving to the right, the Rural Water Corporation. There are 4 of those in Victoria. The major one is Goulburn Murray Water, one I used to be managing director of. And they have an involvement to manage the major dams, storages, places like Eildon, Hume, Dartmouth, Eppalock, and to release the waters from those particular streams into the various streams for the purpose of supplying it to downstream towns and or irrigation purposes. So in the case of Lake Eildon in the centre of Victoria, Eildon releases water into the Goulburn River. The Goulburn River then flows down through Shepparton. Shepparton is a major town or city in the centre of Victoria and draws its water from the Goulburn River. As the water's flowing down the Goulburn River to places beyond and also to irrigators along the way, the Catchment Management Authority on the left, in case of the Shepparton area, it's called the Goulburn Broken Catchment Management Authority because they're looking after effectively the Goulburn River and the Broken River. They're ensuring that river flows are adequate, not eroding the banks of the river, and but meeting the requirements further downstream. Then across to the right there's the urban water corporations. So a number of those in regional Victoria and the ones in the Melbourne area, looking after the supply of drinking water and to homes, residential homes primarily, and taking away of the wastewater and doing some treatment in small plants or moving it forward onto the wholesale treatment facilities at Melbourne Water. And of course, then on the right-hand side, as I touched in the earlier slide, are the three regulators, the ESC for pricing, the EPA for environmental performance, and Department of Health and Human Services for water quality. And at the very bottom, we've got the customers that are often represented with customer committees, advisory groups, trying to get that level of consultation running to a fairly high degree. And in the event of customers who feel disaffected with perhaps their billing arrangements or supply arrangements, whatever, they've got an opportunity to go off to the Energy and Water Ombudsman on the right-hand side to raise their complaint. One of the things that the legislation allows water authorities to do across Victoria is if someone chooses not to pay their bill, this is a bill for water coming into residential homes, unlike gas and electricity, water can't be cut off, but water can be restricted. And the idea of that is a restrictor is put on at the water meter. It still allows water to flow into the home and will fill up the toilet systems, although it might take a little while. So toilets will still operate, but in terms of people using showers or doing other things, it severely affects their activities there. And the idea is that it's meant to encourage delinquent payers to pay the monies. But as I say, in the bottom right-hand corner, if there are issues about what's being done with restrictions or payments or cutting other arrangements back, then the Energy and Water Ombudsman gets looking to have a look at that. Thank you. For the next slide, please. I think that's covered my part. So back to you, Mark.
Thank you very much. Sorry, no, you got one more, Russ?
Oh, no, I've got one more to go. I'm sorry about that. So the Victorian Water Corporations are owned by the government. They act as standalone entities. They're responsible for the management and performance of the activity there. And the chair and the board of directors are really looking after, on the one hand, the responsibilities in the legislation, ensuring that the business plan has been adopted and is being appropriately followed. Each business usually has a strategic plan that covers 1 or 2 years, sometimes 3 years, and that would set out the terms of what capital expenditure is proposed, what sort of operational changes might occur. It will also cover things like these are the levels of profit being budgeted for in that particular period. The people and culture to ensure that all the normal management arrangements are being followed in the proper manner. That's part of the chair and board of directors to oversight. Of course, it's for the management to deliver that, but the chair and board of directors has that oversight function. The corporate governance to meet all of the usual requirements of ensuring conflicts of interest are managed appropriately within the organisation. Usually each board meeting, the financial results of an organisation are reported back to the board, and that would typically take the form of this was the budget level of revenue for the month, this is the budget level of bottom line profit for the month, and these are the actual numbers, and then discussion about why they may be not as good as planned or better than planned, and what the longer term projections for those financial numbers might be. Obviously, the profits coming into the business by virtue of what's retained from the revenues is a function of where the capital expenditure is coming from. So if the profit's not there, there is difficulties with funding the capital expenditure. And of course, the owner of the business is looking for an appropriate dividend return, especially from the bigger businesses set in metropolitan Melbourne. Risk management is always an issue for the board, and often boards would have a risk management subcommittee, and they'd be looking at risks to do with financial arrangements we've just been talking of, but also environment, health and safety, occupational risk, those sorts of things. The managing director, of course, is appointed by the board in Victoria and has the responsibility for the day-to-day operations and ensuring things like the capital works programs are operating as planned, on budget, on time, and other operational budgets are being met appropriately. There's obviously a requirement for the managing director to communicate the priorities that come from the board, and indeed any policies that might be formed at the board level, to communicate that to the staff, and importantly to provide leadership to the staff and opportunities for the staff to grow in their particular roles and to progress through the organisation. So things like staff turnover is an important factor, because one doesn't want middle-ranking staff members to be moving on from the organisation to other places, because that doesn't provide a flow through of continuity. And obviously, the managing director would be responsible for presenting reports and submissions, budgets to the board. So if there's a new piece of work that's being planned, it might have been overseen or thought of in terms of being in the strategic plan, but when it comes down to the specifics, this is who the contractors are who've submitted works. Here are the figures. Here are the pros and the cons of each of the contractors, and this is the one that management, through the managing director, is putting forward to the board for approval to go forward with. So that's basically the way that the flow of things would work, from the management through the board to the final approvals. I think it's back to you now, Mark. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Russell. Thanks, everybody. We've got a few questions from the audience, and the first one I might post to you, Doug, and it's from Anna Kerno. And I was asking, what kind of reporting structure is in place from the board to the owners group out to the councils themselves? You already touched on it, but maybe the frequency, what sort of things get handled? You know, the board to you and the owners group, and then you and the owners on the owners group back to your council.
Yeah, sure. I guess there's the formal levels of communication and reporting, then there's more regular, and then there's informal. So the formal ones are, of course, we get to see the annual plan, the annual report, which come to all the owners, and they typically, I know in my council, for example, would table those reports to the council and able there to be scrutinised. In a slightly less formal way, we have quarterly reports and quarterly briefing sessions. So every quarter, the chairman of the board and the chief executive officer meet with the owners. They do that in each of the 3 regions to make it easier for people to get there. So for the CEO and the chairman, it's quite an onerous task each quarter to get around to the 3 regions and brief the owners' representatives there. And they're given quarterly updates on the corporate business, and they field questions and provide answers to any issues that might come up from a local council's point of view. And then informally, and I know from personal experience that both the chair and the CEO are very open to any questions at any times from owners, representatives. So the individual council, if it's got a particular problem with winding out a program, with a development in the area, or a particular spill situation or something like that, then they've usually got easy access to either the chair or the CEO, and they've been very receptive.
I suppose too, if I can add to that question, is alongside that formal structure around the governance things, there's also the relationship that exists between the local council members and local council staff and the regional managers within TasWater, right? So, and that's really important, that relationship there.
It certainly is. For example, TasWater is got distributed operations. It's got its corporate headquarters in Hobart in the south. It's got a major operational centre up the northwest at Devonport, and it's also got a very significant presence in Launceston. So it's distributed its employment force and workforce, and in that sense, it's really interesting to compare the Taswater as a utility with, say, Aurora Energy or a telecoms provider, where it's incredibly difficult, even with a mayor or general manager of a council, to establish any sort of influence pathway or communications pathway with those GBEs. So Taswater stands streets ahead in terms of access by councils.
Great, thanks. And I'll direct the same question to you, Michael and Russell. How does that process work in Victoria without having, I suppose, that owners representative group in the middle? Because you've got the councils, you've got the state ownership, and then you've got the board.
Okay, I'll jump in there if you like, Mark. In Victoria, we have what we call a statement of obligations, and that's effectively a contract between the minister and the board. And so what that does is that's done using part of actually Section 4.1 Water Act. It uses a section of the Water Act, and what it does is it specifies the obligations of the business in relation to performing its functions and its exercising it. So it ensures that it exercises its power and its functions within the legislation and within a governance framework that has been agreed upon. And if I just talk 1 sec, I'll just give you an idea of the things it covers. The statement of obligation is about 22 pages long, and it covers the pricing, the annual pricing. It covers the governance of the business, customer and community engagement. It actually outlines what your responsibilities are for customer and community engagement. And that's really important, the word community, because it means you don't have to be a customer of a water business to engage with them. You can be part of the community, which is very important in areas where the water business doesn't service, but it may have a catchment, and it may have its pipelines running through your properties or whatever. It also covers risk management in the normal context of risk management for a government entity. It also covers planning. Now, when I say planning, this is all about climate change scenarios. How are you planning, and how are you going to report on how you are dealing with climate change in your business, for however it affects you? In some parts of Victoria, it's climate change through flooding. In other parts, it's climate change through drought. So it's how does it affect you? Then it also requires you to report on your water services. Now, when we say water services, it requires you to report to the government on your bulk water supplies, your water services, your sewage services, your trade waste, and also, very importantly, what money are you raising from developers in creating new estates, new land development? What are you working with inside the regulation for that? And the final part of it is compliance. Now, those things are all reported through to your board. In the cases I've been involved in, every 6 months. If any of those things you're not compliant with in terms of what your agreement is with the government on your statement of obligations, you must report them immediately to the department and the minister and advise of the corrective action you're going to take. So that's, in a nutshell, how the reporting is collated and how it's reported up to the owner of the business. Also, that statement of obligations is also a public document. So anyone can walk into a water business to the reception and request to see it. They don't have to do an FOI or any freedom of information. They can knock on the door and say it. The same thing goes. Doug gives a great outline of the reporting that happens. In the Victorian case, the Act quite clearly states that you can walk into a water business and request to see the corporate plan. You can request to see the register of interest of all the board of directors and all the senior management. You can ask to see that. So there's a lot of transparency, which is vital in this scenario, particularly when you don't come under a Corporations Act, which is quite specific about these matters. You need mechanisms in place. In Victoria, a number of those mechanisms have been put into the Act, Mark.
Thank you. Just on that though, Michael, how is the council, I suppose, kept informed? Are there special meetings held with the council by, in your case, between say Barwon Water and Geelong City Council?
Yes, yes. So as part of that community and customer engagement, groups such as councils or the local environmental group or briefings, there's not a specific mechanism to allow them to be briefed, but the relationships are there because they're long-standing and we need each other. So there's a relationship between the two. For instance, in the greater Geelong area, there's a lot of work going on in building renewable energy plants together with the councils, the 5 councils that Water services. There's a lot of work going on with joint capital investments to ensure that they're all heading in the same direction under the climate change banner. So there is that interface, and it's really bringing together the two organisations. In Victoria currently, DELP actually does a lot of work with local government. The department that looks after water manages local government. And so there is a direct interaction, particularly with the new services of recycled water and things that Victoria is very keen to put out there. There has to be a governance framework between those two about how they're going to work together to utilise the services that each of them have.
Great, thanks. I do want to come back to climate change and stormwater in a minute, but I just want to follow up with a question to Doug, because Michael spoke about the Victorian statement of obligation, and in Tasmania you've got the letter of shareholders' letter of expectation. Can you just highlight a few key I suppose, requirements in that letter?
Sure. Yeah, I didn't mention that the reporting requirements stipulated in a more wide-ranging document called the Shareholders' Letter of Expectation, which the owners and the authority for that is contained in the corporate constitution. So the owners get to articulate their expectations of the board and the company via a Shareholders' Letter of Expectation. And it's a wide-ranging document which includes, apart from reporting requirements, the need for it, for example, to be involved, the owners to be involved with the corporate plan. It sets up a framework for monitoring the board performance. It talks about the relationship between shareholders and the corporation, customer and community engagement, economic development opportunities as councils clearly, you know, if a developer comes along wanting to have a new subdivision, for example, and there are clearly implications for water and sewage, and the councils are a partner in that whole process as the planning authority, then clearly there's a need for close cooperation there. It gets into other aspects like risk management, conservation of water, recycling water, climate change, responding to drought, service standards, trade waste, catchment and catchment planning, environmental management. It talks also about a dividend policy so that any return on investment from the councils is covered there, along with the reporting framework, which I've already covered. So interestingly, all of the governance documents for TasWater, the Constitution, the Shareholders' Letter of Expectation, and the Charter for the Board Selection Committee are all open to the public on TasWater's website.
Great, thanks, Doug. Another question directed at you, Doug, and I like this one. It's from Annie Kerno. In Tasmania, how did the transfer of responsibility work from council to the entities, the water entities? But my favorite, I like this bit, is how did the elected members learn to trust the new entity? How did you learn to love each other?
You're touching on a process, and I think my colleague Mayor Jan Bond might have been talking about the process of it's been a long, difficult political process in Tasmania to get to the point where we are. Councils originally had water and sewage responsibility. In the 1990s, on a regional basis, they collaborated to form wholesale water distribution companies to manage catchments. And then in the early 2000s, or late 2000s actually, driven by the government for water reform, and largely for the reasons that New Zealand's going through. You're having poor performance. We had a number of towns on boiled drinking water alerts, or not consumable even, because of lead poisoning and whatever. So the state government said, well, we've got to do better than this. It's not only is it influencing the health of our people, but it's also goes against the clean green brand that Tasmania likes to, that is very proud of. So the state government stepped in and says, you guys got to reform yourself. The political structure in Tasmania is such that we have a lower house of which forms the government, as you'd expect, but the upper house was at the time largely independent, with most of the members being ex-local government. So the government didn't have the capacity politically to ride in over the top of all the councils and simply dictate total reform. And we ended up with a bastard child halfway through the reform process, which looked at 3 regional corporations and 1 central corporation to provide corporate services. So we had 4 organisations for a number of years, probably about 4 or 5 years. It simply was inefficient and didn't work. And then the government and the councils came together. I was president of the Local Government Association of Tasmania at the time and was pretty heavily involved in that. We negotiated a way forward to build up that trust that you're talking about, and it took a while to do it. It took face-to-face combat as well as contact, but we got there. And I think today, in fact, the last corporate plan was signed off unanimously by the owners. We've been through some tough times with COVID, where dividends couldn't be paid by Taswater because it was under financial stress. We have been through some tough patches there with negotiating with the state government about them wanting to take it over totally. But we've journeyed all that, and we're now in a position where we're all very, very proud of Taswater and what it's achieved. The most standout one was getting all 29 councils that had towns on boiled distribution alerts. We've managed to get all towns on potable water now, and in fact, one of those towns earlier this year won the World Championship for the best quality water, whereas a few years ago it wasn't able to even consume its water. So it's a story we're very proud of. It's been an amazing success story. It carries on to board selection as well, so that when we advertise a position on the board because there's a vacancy, we are inundated right across the country, and in fact from overseas, with people interested in being on the board of Taswater because it's such a standout model.
Thanks, Doug. I'll give you a bit of a break, but I do want to circle back to you with another question from the floor. But I'll pose a question to Russell or Michael, maybe you, Russell, around the handling of stormwater and the impact of climate change, and how are we dealing with that? Stormwater is not part of the Victorian water entity's responsibility, but it does impact it.
Yes, Mark. Well, stormwater, for example, in metropolitan Melbourne is really in the domain of the local councils, the many councils across the city. So they collect the stormwater from individual drains outside of people's homes, and they convey it to larger and larger pipes. And at a point in time, they pass over the responsibility to the wholesaler, Melbourne Water, to run those larger pipes into the final entry point, which is usually different points around the Port Phillip Bay or into the Yarra River. So if you like, in the city of Melbourne, there's a combination of the local councils for the smaller pipes and Melbourne Water for the larger pipes. But over recent years, in fact over a number of years, with the advent of more and more focus on climate change, a lot of folk have come to realise, well, this is actually a resource that could well be better utilised. So people are now thinking about different ways to capture the stormwater, to treat it in some way, and to beneficially use it in different environments. Much easier to do that in a new development where those opportunities lend themselves more readily to that sort of change. I think we'll see more of that happening in the future. If I diverge from Melbourne and go into regional Victoria, country Victoria, and I covered before in my slides the CMAs, the Catchment Management Authorities, a lot of those are responsible for stormwater conveyance into the rivers and streams around the state. And they're interested in making sure that the minimum of damage is done by the flows into streams. They're also interested in knowing what the quality of that water is, particularly if it's coming from areas where there's been agricultural runoff, because the streams in much of regional Victoria serve several purposes. They serve to convey water from storages to places where they might be consumed for agriculture. So they're extracting water from the streams or from the irrigation network to irrigate land, or indeed many of the towns and cities in regional Victoria are extracting their drinking water from these same streams and rivers, running them through treatment plants, often filtration plants, before it's presented as potable water for the residents of the town or the city. So there's a myriad of things happening with stormwater across the state, depending on whether in the capital city of Melbourne or in regional Victoria. But in any event, there's more and more focus being presented or being sent towards how to make a better use of this potential resource of water.
Great, thanks. I'll come back to you, Doug, if I may. Question from Angel McLeod. When water management moved out of council to the water entities, how did the councils, what changed in the council's focus at that point? You didn't have to worry about water anymore. Where did you kind of direct your energy and your focus?
That was certainly a concern that was expressed by a number of councils as we're entering into the reform process. As turned out, in hindsight, I could say that from an elected member's point of view, it's probably made very little difference, because most of the operations of the water and sewage were operational in nature, and that sure, we'd have to tick off on plans, but it was always part of a wider plan like the capital expenditure program or the operating budget. Water and sewage would be a line item, but there were rarely issues that consumed their time as elected representatives. In terms of staff, there were implications there. Clearly, when TasWater formed and the earlier corporations, staff were lost. All the councils had to contribute towards the staffing of the new entity, and so staff were transferred over. It's probably not to our credit that a lot of councils took the opportunity to unload a number of their lesser performing employees, and that was something that TasWater had to live with for a while afterwards, but they've worked through that now as well. What it's done though is, for example, councils in Tasmania still have responsibility for stormwater, and so people have been able to become more expert. The engineering staff, the operational staff have been more focused on the other aspects that they've had, and there hasn't been the distraction of trying to manage water and sewage, for which in many cases, in the cases particularly the small councils, they weren't really qualified anyway to provide the level of services that modern corporations should be able to provide.
Thanks. Thank you, Doug. I might direct a question about the regulator, and I'll direct it to all of you initially and see who best can answer it. We've spoken about the role of the regulator versus the role, the governance role of the board. How do these two key stakeholders or drivers work together to achieve the best outcome for both the corporation and, more importantly, for the customers?
I'll make a quick comment if I may.
Sure.
Mark. In the Victorian model, the price regulator's key issue is to act in the best interest of the customer. So how do they work? It works in a manner of consultation, but you present your pricing submission to the regulator and you are expected to have widely engaged in your community to seek your price. And then the regulator also goes out in the community to ensure that has happened before they make their determination. They make a draft determination, but they've gone out to the community and they've sought their views as to what the water corporation has asked for. Is that correct? Are you backing that? And they speak to a whole range of people, from residential customers through to environmental groups through to councils. So there's a fair where there. But even then, there can often be a disconnect between the regulator who's trying to ensure that prices are kept to a minimum and a water corporation that's planning for long-term future, particularly around long-term assets. It takes time to get a regulator to support you around that. My experience has been around recycled water, where it's taken a long time to get a regulator to provide the returns on recycled water because it is a long-term project and it has very little benefits in the first few years.
In Tasmania, it's very much the same situation as Michael's described. That constant interaction between the staff of the corporation and the regulator staff, they work together, but at the end of the day, the philosophy behind it all is a utility such as Taswater and the utilities in Victoria are monopoly providers, and there's no market forces to keep the prices down. So the economic regulator is there to ensure that consumers get a fair price.
Great, thanks, Doug.
I think if I could add to that, Mark, is that I think what Michael said certainly represents the situation with the economic regulator today. But if we go back to the early days of the formation of the economic regulator, there wasn't a lot of history to draw on in terms of what was the right level of expenditure for new capital works, and they were reliant on the use of external consultants to review pricing plans and these sorts of things. And sometimes there was a bit of a miscommunication between the Water Authority and the economic regulator in those early days, and especially when intermediary consultants were being used to help and analyse what was there. So I think what Michael has described is really what has progressed from those early days, and that is the consultation from both the Water Authority with the community before the plan goes in, and the consultation with the community from the regulator after they've got the plan there, and there's a lot more check and balance. It's a system that works a lot better now than what it did when it was first set off 20 years ago.
To that point, Russell, can you think of any examples where there might have been a conflict and how that could have been resolved? Could have been overpricing or whatever.
I certainly can, because when that, in fact, it's called the ESC, Essential Services Commission today. It was set up, it was initially called the Office of Regulator General. Now, the Office of Regulator General started in a brand new office, brand new people, no history. So they looked around the world, as people do, to see what's happening in other jurisdictions. They looked particularly at the UK, and they looked at Ofwat, their equivalent body over there, and how Ofwat was dealing with the private sector water authorities in the UK. And the Ofwat had sort of formed a view that the private sector water operators always asked for a bigger increase, because of course they were looking for a profit return, always asked for a bigger increase than what they really needed, and they often sort of padded out their works programs to justify it. So when the ORG in Victoria was starting off, they started off with the sort of, if you like, the level of suspicion that was occurring in the UK, and they had to think, well, you know, how do we make sure the same thing doesn't happen here? They didn't really have much to worry about, because we had really government-owned water authorities where involvement from the ministers of the day or the premier of the day would override this anyway. But there was a degree of suspicion that started off, and hence it was a difficult working relationship in those early days 20 years ago. But it's matured now to something which is very very functional.
Great, thank you. Question here from Sarah Harris. Sarah said she's interested to know on how ownership and governance works in practice, and perhaps more so where there's been some few pain points or conflicts in your experiences where things maybe haven't gone so well. Can we think of anything?
Well, I did touch on the issue that we had with paying dividends and the aspect of COVID and the need to take less dividends so that the whole system's infrastructure could be performed, in particular with regard to drinking water. And for example, when TasWater was first set up, we were expecting a dividend to local government of $30 million, which would be distributed according to equity to the 29 councils. There was a recognition that we'd have to reduce that when we wanted to get all the towns onto good drinking water. And so that was cut back to $20 million, which left $10 million to contribute to those programs. That was a board decision, but it was negotiated with the owners. That was quite difficult. And then when COVID came along and TasWater couldn't pay dividends for a year, then that was difficult as well, but it was negotiated with the owners. So the situation we have is robust enough to facilitate that, but it doesn't stop there being painful points.
Thanks, Doug. A couple of talking points now, maybe that came from some of the previous sessions. And the key ones around privatisation. I know in Victoria, the initial, I suppose, government plan was going to be to privatise everything. It didn't happen for water. Russell, I think you were probably more involved in it than anyone else. Can you talk about that? And also what protections have been put in place against privatisation, whether it be in Tasmania or Victoria? So firstly, maybe how Victoria turned away from privatisation of water and the protections.
At the time of the disaggregation of the old Melbourne Water into 3 retail businesses and the new Melbourne Water, which is a wholesale business, was just after the Kennett government had come into power, Liberal government, and the state was in a fairly dire situation financially then. The state had lost its AAA credit rating. The new government was determined to do things to improve the financial capacity of the state, and they came in with a mission of privatising electricity, privatising gas, and then to privatise water. As they went through the privatisation of electricity and gas, breaking it up into smaller bodies and selling them off, they generated a lot more money than they had expected. So when it got to the stage, a year or two later, of looking more seriously at privatising water, they really didn't have the financial drive that they had at the time that the government had been elected. They were also picking up a pretty strong message from their constituents that there was something special about water. Water was sacrosanct, shouldn't be in for private sector's hands. Things could go wrong. It's an interesting argument, discussion for another day. But the message, nevertheless, to the Kennett government was, we'll back away from privatising water. They made it quite clear that's the way they were heading forward. They had instead corporatised water. So what that meant is they'd set up the 4 businesses in Melbourne, and they were due to do the same with the businesses in regional Victoria to follow, but they'd set up the 4 businesses in Melbourne as corporate entities owned by the government, but subject to corporations law and subject to the directors, who were skill-based directors, but coming from higher levels within the private sector, that they would be responsible as individual directors if things went wrong. So it was really quite a severe level to put upon the new boards of these corporatised entities, but the government at that time thought this was the better way to go. The word corporatisation was probably not the best word to use because the general public couldn't differentiate that word from privatisation. So I remember for many, many months, we were always getting letters or comments from customers about, now that you've been privatised, da, 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 da. Of course, we hadn't been, but they had confused that with corporatisation. So that was sort of how the journey went. The other side of politics along the way made it clear that they would clearly not privatise water either. So we really had both sides of Parliament saying categorically they wouldn't privatise water. They could still do it. Either side could do it if they chose to, but it's their public policy position, long-standing now, that wouldn't happen. But having said that, if you look closely at how the water industry works in Victoria, in Melbourne, in regional areas, there have been a number of boot schemes put up by external engineering
Can you explain boot?
organisations. So boot stands, as an acronym, stands for build, own, operate and transfer. So the business I used to run at Suez d'Egremont would typically run a boot scheme for a water authority. They would come along and say, we will, for so many dollars, build a new plant. It might be a wastewater plant. It might be a drinking water purification plant like Prospect in New South Wales, supplies 80% of Sydney's water. We'll build it to our design, and then we'll own it for 20 or 25 years. So if we build it and skimp on the equipment, we'll pay the price because it'll break down too soon. And then we'll transfer it. So we'll build it, own it, and then transfer it to the water authority at the end of that concession, or we might renew it. Now, I think in the case of the one at Lower Hutt in New Zealand, which was a Suez plant that I was involved with, that was set up in about 2002 or 3 as a boot scheme. It was to run for 20 years and to be transferred to the new authority. And looking at some things on the web just the other night, I noticed that the Wellington Water Organisation actually must have brought it forward by a year or so because it was transferred to Wellington Water last year. So I hope that's answered your question.
Doug, is there any protections in your laws against privatisation, or is it just intent of government?
It'd be a political no-go. I mean, an act of parliament could actually bring it about, of course, but I don't sense any appetite at all for that from either political persuasion.
Okay, thank you. Question from Anna Kerno, and maybe back to you again, Doug. Have there been any instances of council intentions or council requirements not being delivered by the water entity?
I think the only one is one I've mentioned in regard to dividends. There is a provision in the shareholders' letter of expectation that if the board is unable to comply with the expectations set by the owners, then they have to notify that. So it becomes a matter of negotiation. The only one I'm aware of is over the dividend policy, which I've already described.
So examples such as, I know the Tas Water holding up its end of, say, a development plan for a particular region and all that. That process has worked well.
Yeah, it has. I mean, there have been a couple of cases where it's been escalated to a point of fairly strong discussions between a particular council and the board, but these have been resolved before they've become formalised. Mm-hmm. I think we also had, and to some extent it's ongoing, as part of improving our game in Tasmania, new regulations came in regard to how trade waste was managed. That became a bit of a political issue. The problem, for example, was if a restaurant or a seafood factory, for example, just discharges all its waste without treatment into the sewage system, then the sewage system can become blocked up, can become inefficient. And there's a level of, there's a standard for which wastewater should go into the system to be treated, and bringing all the businesses in Tasmania into compliance with that has been a bit painful, but it's been something that's been negotiated, including with the state government in the process. So what we've got is a corporation that's willing to open its ears and eyes to negotiation and to work through these difficult issues that are invariably there, have to be dealt with, but you've got a corporation that's willing to work through that.
Great, thanks. Because my understanding with the trade waste scenario, particularly in the north of the state, is Tas Water worked over time with the customers there, with the trade waste customers. So it didn't impose anything in a hurry or forcefully. It gave them time.
Well, and it was able to negotiate both ways. I mean, it was able to negotiate with the regulators, say, look, we're on a get well plan here. And so the regulators were able to back off on insisting on things happening immediately. But it also was able to talk with the customers and actually set up a low interest loan scheme to help some of the customers get on board.
Great, thank you.
Mark, in the Victorian model, that's been a major point of contention, but it's also vitally important when we talk about things like trade waste, because trade waste has a huge effect on the final product that Water Corporation of Victoria is trying to sell their customers, recycled water.
Yeah.
And so the charges are being made appropriately to make as a user pay system for what you put into the wastewater system. But it also affects the plants, and affects the plant's life, as Doug would know, significantly. The trade waste that goes into the system can have a major effect on the useful life of the plants at the other end. So it's something that can never be ignored in terms of the responsibility of boards and management to effectively manage.
A question from Anna again, and this is: would the system work if the board became less cooperative? Are there any aspects? Is there any aspect of mandating council requirements?
Absolutely. At the end of the day, the owners' representative group through the board selection committee can fire the board and reappoint and appoint. They can agree to extend the director's term for a maximum of 2 terms. So the influence pathway of the owners, in other words, the councils over the board, is that there's inferred power as well as direct control through shareholders' letter of expectation.
Great, thank you. And I suppose in Victoria, it's pretty much to the will of the minister, right? Left to the board to make those decisions around the board performance.
Yes, there is. There's an annual board performance review, but on top of that, there's also the scenario of what the Act calls a ministerial direction. So the minister it can be verbal, it can be in writing. If it's verbal, you have to document it as the company secretary of that board, but the minister can give you a clear direction in writing of an action you are to undertake that the board may not wish to. I have seen that happen.
That does happen.
Yep, I've seen that happen in terms of building a massive infrastructure that the board felt wasn't viable. The minister gave a lawful instruction, build it.
Great, thank you. Russell, do you have anything to add there, or?
Well, just as an example of what Mike was just talking about, in the early days of South East Water, there was an obligation to do what was called backlog sewering of the Mornington Peninsula. So this was an area that had developed over many, many years. People had installed their own septic tanks throughout the place, and the population was getting large, and the septic tanks were not working too well, and they were leaching out into the pristine waters of Port Phillip Bay. So there was an obligation there, which had something like a financial amount of $300 million involved. The legislation of the day would allow the authority to collect about $1,000 from each beneficiary household or property, but yet the average cost per property was going to be of the order of $10,000 to $12,000. So there was, on the one hand, a message coming from government, the shareholder, saying, we'd like you to carry on and do this work. And the newly appointed corporatised board of directors of South East Water, who were liable to make sure things were done in a financially astute manner, were saying, why should we be spending all this money on a project that is clearly a losing project? We don't want to do this. It doesn't make sense. We're really in breach of corporations law to do so. So the end result was that there was a directive given to the board by a written directive from the treasurer of the day, Ellen Stockdale, and it basically said, you must go forward and do this. The only concession was, instead of spending $300 million next year, it was eked out over, I can't remember exactly, maybe it was 10 or 15 years. So it was a smaller volume. It was something which was more able to be tolerated in those days. And I think since then, my successors have come forward with different technology, which has caused that $10,000 to $12,000 average cost per property to be vastly reduced. So right. I guess that was an example.
Thanks. While you're there, Russell, can you just comment about how conflicts of interest of board members are handled and what protections are in place?
Okay. Well, conflicts of interest fall into 2 categories. There are real conflicts of interest and there are perceived conflicts of interest. And the real conflicts of interest are those where a board member has knowingly done something wrong to maybe enrich themselves. The perceived conflicts of interest are much, much larger in their nature. And it's the general public thinking that such and such a person is in a privileged position, they're able to do this or do that, that might enrich themselves. May never happen. For me, it's the more difficult one is the perceived conflict of interest, because that's the one that sometimes is not so real, but people perceive it to be real. So you start off, I think, with a government business enterprise having a corporate governance manual. And in that corporate governance manual, the directors should sign up to it and say they understand, they've read it, they understand what's obliged, what obligations they need to take on. Part of that is to disclose any situation which would cause a conflict of interest to come up. I can recall one example early in the days of South East Water. One of the directors was also working for an IT company as a director, and that IT company was going to be bidding for, along with others, for a billing system. So before anything had even happened, he put his hand up to say, I can't be part of this process. So all of the board papers that went out to directors on that subject had that section excluded for the particular director. And when it came to talk about it in the agenda, he excluded himself from the meeting, went outside, and it was duly documented. That was the way that was handled. It worked quite well. There was always an element in the board agenda that I'm aware of that we put there, which would open the meeting by saying, are there any declarations of interest that need to be made? And are there any conflict of interest that directors need to refer to? So that was done fairly well. Where there's a great challenge, though, is in the rural water settings, because they are quite different to the towns and the cities in Victoria, where water is being supplied through meters into people's homes. In the rural situation where people are buying water in big volumes for irrigation, people who have water entitlements are able to trade those water entitlements. It's a bit like trading shares. If you live in Melbourne or Sydney, people could be trading their water entitlements on a weekly basis, a fortnightly basis. They might be buying more temporary water, or they might be selling temporary water, depending on where the allocations are going. So in a situation like that, it's a much more difficult situation to handle conflicts of interest, because if you have, for example, an irrigator representative on a board in a rural environment who has ownership of water in terms of their property, they might choose, because water prices move from sort of $100 a megalitre up to $1,000 a megalitre for that year, depending on scarcity. They might choose, for example, as a dairy farmer, not to irrigate and produce fodder for the year and just buy in hay, whereas the people who are running orchards need to keep their orchards going, so they've got to buy water, otherwise their orchard dies. So that has to be handled in a different way. And I think one of the best ways to handle it is to do it a bit like the politicians handle their share portfolio when they come into government. They say, I'll put my shares in a blind trust, I'll put it out of day-to-day reach, someone else will manage it for me. What doesn't mean that they've sold their shares, just that they won't trade in those shares and they'll keep away from it. I think that would work very well. The other thing which would work very well would be for the government owner of that business to decide to appoint directors who either don't have water to buy and sell, or who will agree not to buy and sell water during the term of their office. There are different ways to adopt that. And I think to finalise that point is that in all the boards I've been involved with, we've always had this 360-degree review by peers. And if there was anything untoward occurring, that would usually pop up. And that's a good way of a final check and balance to make sure that all of the peers of the people on the board are comfortable with the level of corporate governance that's being applied.
Thank you. Okay, guys, I might start to wrap it up for today. I might just ask each of you to make a concluding comment or provide any advice on governance and reforms. I'll go to you first, Doug. You're muted, mate.
Well, thanks very much. And thanks again for being able to participate. I guess the only advice I would put forward is that given where we were with the standard of water and sewage services, the deteriorating infrastructure, the lack of expertise in providing a modern water and sewage infrastructure in the state, TasWater was something that's been a fantastic outcome. It was painful considering it. It was painful at times going through it, but having got there, it was definitely worth it.
Thank you, Doug. And by the way, we'll be hearing from some of the executives from TasWater in the week after next when we look at what they're currently doing there at the moment. Michael.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the opportunity, everyone, today to speak to you. My concluding comment really is about my area of expertise. If you have a strong board governance framework and it complies with your owner's expectations, as Doug has pointed out to us a couple of times, their great model, it is a recipe for success, because exactly as Doug said, you will focus on what your business is, and the governance will assist you in focusing in on that. So I wish you luck, and I believe that the models that Victoria has and Tasmania has support a strong water business.
Great, thanks, Michael. And just to that point, Michael was CFO of Barwon Water. He's still involved with Barwon Water, and we'll be hearing from the Managing Director of Barwon Water, Tracy Slatter, in a couple of weeks too, when we look at some of the rural water or regional water corporations. Russell.
Yeah, so firstly, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I wish you all the very best with your deliberations as you make this this very interesting journey. And I think as you make this journey, I think very much of it is about what's best for the community to provide the future requirements that they need to be supplied with. And I think the process you're going through with Spiker of looking at what people are doing in other parts of the country, particularly Australia, is a worthwhile thing, because everyone does things a little differently. Not to say that things are always better here or there or whatever, but to take the input from a number of different sources and to filter out of that what seems to be best for your needs is, I think, a very good management tool. So I wish you every success with that, and hope it all goes very well. Thank you.
Right. Okay, thank you, everyone. Thanks to the panel. Thanks to the audience. I will conclude today's webinar now, and wish you, and echo what the panel said, I wish you all the best of luck and stay safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.